He controlled Chicago's underworld with a whisper, but when he ordered a tired, blood-stained nurse to let him walk out of a trauma bay, she simply looked him in the eye and said, "No." That single, defiant word sparked a dangerous obsession that would tear two entirely different worlds apart. The emergency department at Chicago's Northwestern Memorial Hospital was a symphony of controlled chaos at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The air always smelled faintly of bleach, metallic copper, and stale coffee. Leora Adams, a senior trauma nurse, was running on her fourth consecutive 12-hour shift, fueled by nothing but adrenaline and a lukewarm espresso. She was 27, fiercely dedicated, and entirely immune to the dramatics of the human race. When you spend your nights pulling people back from the brink of death, the superficial power dynamics of the waking world lose their intimidation factor. The sliding doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open, they were violently shoved apart. There was no blaring siren, no paramedic radioing ahead. Instead, 3 massive men in dark, rain-soaked tailored suits rushed through the doors carrying a fourth. The silence of their arrival was more terrifying than any alarm. The hospital staff froze, instinctively recognizing the heavy, predatory energy of the men invading their space. "So we need a doctor, now." "No names, no police," the lead man barked. His hand rested conspicuously inside his suit jacket. Dr. Peter Henderson, the attending physician on duty, went pale. He recognized the man bleeding out on the gurney. Everyone in Chicago who watched the news knew the face, even if they whispered the name. Domenico Lupchese. He was the head of the Lupche family, a man who allegedly owned half the judges in Cook County and controlled the shipping ports with an iron grip. He was a ghost to the law, but right now, he was a rapidly fading mortal in the ER. Domenico's bespoke Brioni shirt was soaked through with crimson. He had taken 2 hollow-point bullets, one shattering his left collarbone, the other buried deep in his right abdomen. Despite the catastrophic blood loss, his eyes were open. They were a piercing, cold obsidian, tracking every movement in the room with paranoid intensity. "Get him to Trauma 1. Leora ordered, her voice slicing through the frozen panic of the room. She didn't care if he was the Pope or a cartel boss. A bleeding patient was a bleeding patient. Dr. Henderson stammered. "Wait, Leora. Protocol dictates we stop him from bleeding out on our linoleum." "Peter," Leora snapped, already grabbing a stack of trauma pads and throwing her weight against the gurney to steer it down the hall. Inside the stark, fluorescent glare of Trauma 1, Domenico's bodyguards tried to crowd the room. One of them, a hulking man named Leo, stood directly over the bed, his hand hovering over his concealed weapon. "You have to leave," Dora said, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. "We stay with the boss," Leo growled, his voice like grinding gravel. Domenico, pale and sweating heavily, raised a shaking, blood-stained hand. "Leo, stay." His voice was raspy, thick with pain, but it still held undeniable authority. "No anesthesia. I need to stay awake." Dr. Henderson, trembling, picked up a syringe of fentanyl. "Mr. Luxe, your blood pressure is plummeting. We have to operate, and we cannot do that with you conscious," I said. Domenico breathed heavily, locking his terrifying gaze on the doctor. "No." "Put the needle down," asked. The room went dead silent. "Doctor." Henderson actually took a step back, terrified. Domenico tried to push himself up on his good elbow, blood gushing fresh from his abdominal wound, his jaw set in a hard line of stubborn dominance. He was going to command his own survival, just as he commanded his empire. Leora had enough. She stepped forward, placed her gloved hands firmly on Domenico's uninjured right shoulder, and shoved him hard back onto the mattress. "No," she said. The word rang out like a gunshot in the sterile room. Leo pulled his weapon, the metallic click of the safety, disengaging, echoing off the tile walls. Dr. Henderson whimpered. Leora didn't even look at the gun. She kept her eyes locked entirely on Domenico's shocked, obsidian gaze. "You are tachycardic. Your systolic pressure is in the 70s, and if you keep moving, that abdominal bullet is going to nick your hepatic artery, and you will drown in your own blood in less than 3 minutes." Domenico stared at her for the first time in perhaps his entire life. Someone had not only laid hands on him in anger, but had completely dismissed his authority. He looked at this woman, her hair tied up in a messy bun, dark circles under her hazel eyes, her scrub stained with his blood, and found himself utterly silenced. "Unless that gun shoots surgical gauze, tell your ape to put it away and get out of my trauma bay," Leora said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I am in charge here. You will shut up, you will let the doctor put you under, and you will let me save your life. Do you understand?" Sagantum was thick enough to suffocate on. Leo stepped forward, ready to drag her away from the bed, but Domenico raised his hand again. A strange, breathless sound escaped his lips. It took Leora a second to realize it was a chuckle. Domenico wheezed, his eyes never leaving Leora's face. "Get out. Boss, out." "Yes." The command was final. As the bodyguards reluctantly backed out of the room, Leora snatched the syringe from the paralyzed doctor. Henderson and injected it straight into Domenico's IV line. Count backward from 10, Mr. Lucchese," she said coldly, already reaching for the trauma shears to cut away his ruined designer shirt. As the darkness of the anesthetic pulled him under, Domenico fought to keep his eyes open just a second longer, burning the image of her defiant face into his memory. 10. He whispered. 9. I'll remember you, nurse. Good, Leora muttered, tossing the bloody fabric to the floor. Maybe you'll remember to pay your hospital bill, scalpel doctor. 2 days later, the atmosphere on the 8th floor of Northwestern Memorial had completely changed. The VIP wing, usually reserved for politicians and high-profile celebrities, had been entirely locked down. Men in dark suits sat in the waiting areas, paced the corridors, and scrutinized every food tray and medical cart that came through the elevator doors. Domenico Lucchese had survived a 4-hour surgery. The bullets were extracted, the bleeding was stopped, and he was stitched together. But surviving the bullets was only half the battle. Surviving his recovery was proving to be a nightmare for the hospital staff. In 48 hours, Domenico had fired 3 private nurses, thrown a tray of hospital food against a wall, and refused to let anyone change his dressings except the terrified doctor. Henderson, he was a caged tiger, paranoid, in pain, and furious at his temporary vulnerability. Down in the ER, Leora was charting her files when the hospital's chief administrator, a nervous man named Arthur Pendleton, approached her desk, wringing his hands. "Leora, I need a favor, a massive favor," Arthur pleaded. Leora didn't look up from her screen. "I'm not doing a double shift, Arthur. I'm legally mandated to sleep eventually." "It's not a double. I need you to go up to the 8th floor, Suite 801. Leora stopped typing. Suite 801. She knew exactly who was up there. Absolutely not. I am a trauma nurse, not a concierge for the Mafia." He was refusing care from everyone else. Arthur practically begged, sweat beading on his forehead. Specifically asked for the blonde with the attitude, Leora, his people are making the board extremely nervous. They just made a $2 million anonymous donation to the pediatric wing this morning. Please, just change his dressings and check his vitals." The Leora sighed, closing her eyes. She thought about the pediatric wing, which desperately needed the funding. Grabbing her stethoscope and a fresh tray of medical supplies, she stood up. "If he throws anything at me, Arthur, I'm pressing assault charges. I don't care who he is." When Leora bypassed the heavily guarded security checkpoint and pushed open the heavy oak door of Suite 801, she found Domenico sitting up in bed, working on a secure encrypted laptop, a phone pressed to his ear. He looked paler than usual, but the sheer force of his presence filled the luxurious sunlit room. He glanced up as she entered, abruptly ending his call. A single father named that would unravel his entire world. "You're late. I'm right on time for a patient I wasn't assigned to," Leora replied dryly, setting her tray down on the bedside table with a loud clatter. "Laptop away, Mr. Lucchese. I need to check your stitches." He didn't move. He just watched her, analyzing her every movement like a predator studying its prey. "You have a lot of nerve, Leora Adams." She paused, snapping on her gloves. "You looked up my file." "I look up everyone who puts their hands on me," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. "You've been at Northwestern for 5 years. Perfect record. No husband, no boyfriend. You live in a modest apartment in Logan Square. And your younger sister Sophia has a severe case of multiple sclerosis. The medical bills are staggering." Leora's blood ran cold. The casual way he weaponized her private life sent a spike of pure rage through her chest. She stepped right up to the edge of his bed, leaning down so they were eye to eye. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed, her voice vibrating with quiet fury. "If you ever mention my sister again, or send anyone near my family, I will personally make sure the next time your heart stops, I take my coffee break before fetching the defibrillator." Domenico didn't flinch. Instead, his eyes darkened with a mixture of respect and intense fascination. He wasn't used to women standing up to him. He was used to people crumbling under his scrutiny, eager to please or desperate to flee. Leora did neither. "I wasn't threatening you, Leora," he said softly. "I was going to offer you a job. $10,000 a week. You leave this hospital. You come work for me at my estate as my private, live-in medical retainer." Leora tore the tape off his bandages, with a bit more force than medically necessary. He grunted in pain, but didn't look away. "I save lives, Mr. Lucchese," she said coldly, inspecting the angry red incision on his abdomen. "I don't follow mobsters home like a well-paid pet. My answer is no. Keep your money. I can pay off Sophia's debts by the end of the day. One phone call, and then you own me." "No." As she leaned over to apply fresh antiseptic, the heavy wooden door to the suite clicked open. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet room it drew both their attention. A man dressed in hospital orderly scrubs walked in, carrying a stack of towels. Something instantly felt wrong to Leora. The man's scrubs were green. Northwestern Memorial orderlies wore navy blue. Furthermore, he wasn't wearing a hospital ID badge, and his eyes were completely fixed on Domenico, ignoring the nurse entirely. Domenico sensed it too. His body went rigid, his hand instinctively reaching under his pillow where Leora knew he had coerced Leo into hiding a 9mm pistol. But the fake orderly was faster. He dropped the towels, revealing a silenced weapon, and raised it toward the bed. Leora didn't think. Instinct, forged in the chaotic adrenaline of the trauma ward, took over. She grabbed the heavy metal saline stand next to the bed and swung it with all her might into the orderly's back just as he pulled the trigger. Thwip! The silenced bullet missed Domenico's head by inches, burying itself into the mahogany headboard. The assassin stumbled forward from the blow of the metal stand. Before he could recover and aim again, Domenico had his weapon out. 2 deafening shots rang out in the confined room. The assassin dropped to the floor, lifeless. The door burst open seconds later, Leo and 3 other guards flooding into the room, weapons drawn, shouting. Leora was backed against the wall, her chest heaving, her hands gripping the edges of the medical cart. She stared at the dead man on the floor, the metallic smell of gunpowder mixing sickeningly with the scent of antiseptic. Domenico ignored his men. He dropped his gun on the bed and looked at Leora, his chest heaving, a fresh patch of red blooming on his newly dressed bandages. He had torn his stitches. "You just saved my life," he said, his voice tight with pain, but his eyes blazing with an entirely new emotion. "Again." "You're bleeding," Leora managed to say, her professional programming overriding her shock. She stepped over the dead body, walked back to the bed, and grabbed a fresh trauma pad. "Leo, lock down the hospital. Get the cars ready," Domenico barked to his men. He looked back at Leora. "You're coming with us. It's not safe for you here anymore. The Moretti family knows who you are now." Leora pressed the pad hard against his bleeding abdomen. She looked at the blood on her hands, then up at the most dangerous man in Chicago. "No, Domenico," she whispered firmly. "Lie back down. You're tearing your stitches." The silence in Suite 801 was shattered by the shrill wail of approaching sirens echoing off the Chicago skyscrapers. Leora kept her blood-soaked hands firmly pressed against Domenico's abdomen. The torn stitches were weeping heavily, painting his pale skin a violent crimson. "You are not going anywhere," she repeated, her voice shaking but her grip unyielding. "If you stand up, you will hemorrhage." Leo, entirely ignoring her medical authority, pressed an earpiece deep into his ear, his face draining of color. "Boss," the bodyguard barked, racking the slide of his weapon. "It's not just the ambulance. CPD just breached the lobby. Dispatch says it's Detective Miller's unit." Domenico's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked up at Leora, the cold calculation returning to his obsidian eyes. "Miller is a dog on the Moretti family payroll," he rasped, his breath catching as another wave of pain hit him. "Isn't coming up here to arrest me. He's coming up here to finish what that fake orderly started." Leora froze. "The police? You're paranoid. We are in the middle of Northwestern Memorial. Look at the man dead on the floor, Leora." "Leora," Domenico snapped, his voice a sudden booming thunderclap that made her flinch. He reached up, wrapping his large calloused hand over her wrists. His skin was burning with fever, but his grip was like a steel vice. "You just killed a Moretti hitman. You are a witness. In 10 minutes, Detective Miller will walk through those doors, put a bullet in my head, and then put one in yours, claiming we shot each other. And then he will send a squad car to Logan Square to pay a visit to your sister, Sophia." The mention of Sophia stripped the air straight from Leora's lungs. The clinical detachment she used as armor shattered. You have 60 seconds to decide, nurse," Domenico said softly, his dark eyes boring into hers. "Stay here and trust the badges that the Morettis bought, or come with me and live." There was no time for a moral debate. The heavy thud of combat boots echoed from the stairwell at the end of the hall. "Get the freight elevator," Leora yelled at Leo, instantly shifting into high gear. She grabbed a handful of pressure dressings, a portable oxygen canister, and a staple gun from the medical cart, shoving them into her scrub pockets. "Help me get him up. If we drop him, he dies." Leo and another guard hoisted Domenico to his feet. The Mafia boss let out a guttural groan, his face turning an ashen gray, but he forced his legs to move. Leora kept her shoulder wedged under his right arm, pressing the trauma pad against his side as they moved as a chaotic, bleeding unit out of the suite and down the back corridor. They hit the service elevator just as the doors to the VIP wing burst open. The shouts of armed men echoed behind them. "Hold the doors!" Lyko shouted, slamming his fist onto the basement button. The descent felt like an eternity. Domenico leaned heavily against the steel wall of the elevator, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked down at Leora, who was furiously assembling a portable IV bag. "You're coming with me," he whispered. "Shut up and keep pressure on your side," she snapped, jamming the needle into the crook of his arm and taping it down with ruthless efficiency. The doors chimed open to the hospital's underground loading dock. 3 black, heavily armored Cadillac Escalades were idling, their engines emitting a low, predatory growl. The rain had started pouring outside, turning the Chicago night into a blur of slick asphalt and neon reflections. "Ha! In the back! Go! Go! Go!" Leo roared, pushing them toward the center vehicle. Leora practically shoved Domenico into the back seat, climbing in right behind him just as the Escalade's tires shrieked against the concrete. The convoy blasted out of the loading dock, tearing onto the street and immediately plunging down the ramp into the subterranean labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive. Lower Wacker was a concrete cavern beneath the city, devoid of GPS signals and heavily populated by shadows, the perfect place to lose a tail. The driver took the corners at 70 miles an hour, throwing Leora against Domenico's massive frame. "Turn on the overhead light," Leora commanded, ignoring the terrifying speed of the vehicle. She straddled Domenico's legs to stabilize herself, ripping open the sterile packaging of the surgical stable gun. "Hold him down, Leo." "Ha! Are you doing surgery in a moving car?" Leo yelled from the front seat, looking back in horror. "I'm closing a ruptured incision so your boss doesn't bleed out on Italian leather," Leora shot back. She looked down at Domenico. The arrogant mobster was fading, sweat dripping from his forehead, but his eyes were locked on her face. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, her voice dropping to a softer, almost gentle tone. "Do it," he breathed. With the SUV swerving violently to avoid structural pillars in the underground tunnel, Leora went to work. She didn't have anesthetic. She didn't have a sterile field. But she had nerve. She pinched the edges of the torn incision together and fired the staple gun. Click, click, click. Domenico let out a roar, suffocated roar, his hands gripping the leather seat so hard his knuckles turned white. But he didn't try to stop her. By the time the Escalades rocketed out of Lower Wacker and merged onto Lakeshore Drive, heading north toward the affluent suburbs, Leora had stabilized the wound. She fell back against the opposite door, her hands covered in his blood, her chest heaving. Domenico, panting heavily, let his head fall back against the headrest. A slow, exhausted smirk touched his lips. "Remind me," he whispered hoarsely, "to double your salary." "I haven't accepted the job," she fired back, wiping her bloody hands on her ruined scrubs. "You're in my car, Leora," Domenico replied, his eyes heavy but victorious. "You're already mine." The Lucchese estate in Winnetka was less of a home and more of a modern fortress masquerading as a billionaire's architectural dream. Hidden behind 20-foot wrought iron gates and acres of dense forest overlooking Lake Michigan, the property was swarming with armed men by the time the convoy arrived. Leora barely had time to process the sheer scale of the mansion before she was ushered down a discreet hallway that opened into a state-of-the-art underground medical wing. It rivaled Northwestern's VIP suite equipped with a surgical bay, heart monitors, and a fully stocked pharmacy. Once Domenico was transferred to a hospital bed and hooked up to a stable IV, Leora went to work cleaning and properly redressing his wounds. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was racing with panic. "Sophia," Leora said suddenly, dropping a pair of forceps onto the metal tray. She turned to Leo, who was standing guard by the door. "He said the cops would go after my sister. I need my phone. I have to call her." "That won't be necessary," a weak but deep voice said from the bed. Leora whipped around. Domenico was awake, the color slowly returning to his face thanks to the fluid replacement. He gestured weakly toward a set of double doors at the far end of the medical bay. The doors opened. A woman in a wheelchair, looking incredibly confused and clutching a blanket, was rolled into the room by a massive guard in a suit. "Sophia!" Leora gasped, sprinting across the room and dropping to her knees beside her younger sister. She checked her over frantically. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you? Leora? What is going on?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. "These men showed up at the apartment. They said there was a gas leak. But then they put me in a private ambulance. Where are we?" Leora hugged her sister tightly, tears of sheer relief burning her eyes. She looked back at Domenico. The Mafia boss was watching them, his expression unreadable. He had orchestrated Sophia's extraction while he was bleeding out in the hospital bed. "She has her own suite upstairs, fully accessible," Domenico said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "A private chef, 24-hour nursing staff for her MS treatments. She is safer here than she has ever been in her entire life." Leora stood up, wiping her eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why go through all this trouble for a nurse who told you no?" "Because you are the only person in my world who isn't afraid to tell me the truth," Domenico replied softly. Before Leora could process the weight of his words, the doors to the medical bay swung open again. Two of Domenico's enforcers dragged a man into the room, throwing him roughly onto the pristine white tile floor. Leora gasped. It was Dr. Tada, Peter Henderson. The attending physician was bruised, his designer coat torn, his face a mask of absolute terror. He scrambled backward until his back hit the stainless steel cabinets. "Dr. Henderson?" Leora whispered, stepping forward in shock. What is he doing here?" "Tell her, Peter," Domenico commanded, his voice suddenly dropping 20 degrees, turning into the lethal whisper that made the entire Chicago underworld tremble. Henderson began to sob openly. "I'm sorry, Leora. I'm so sorry. I didn't have a choice." Leo stepped forward, handing Domenico a sleek black tablet. Domenico didn't even look at it. He held it out toward Leora. She took it cautiously. On the screen was a bank statement, followed by heavily encrypted text messages. "Your esteemed doctor," Domenico explained coldly, "has a severe gambling addiction. He owed the Moretti family $200,000. When I was brought into his ER, they offered to clear his debt. If he gave them my room number, disabled the camera in the hallway, and let their assassin borrow a pair of scrubs." Leora felt the world tilt on its axis. She looked at Henderson, a man she had respected, a man who had sworn an oath to save lives. He had sold them out. He had almost gotten Domenico, herself, and potentially her sister killed over a poker debt. "You knew the assassin was coming," Leora said to Henderson, her voice shaking with disgust. "You knew I was in that room with him." "They said they'd only hurt him," Henderson pleaded, crawling toward her. "The Laura, please. You have to believe me. They threatened my family." "And what about mine?" Leora yelled, the betrayal igniting a fierce, protective rage in her chest. She pointed at Sophia. "They would have killed my sister to tie up loose ends, Peter." Domenico watched Leora intently. The fire in her eyes was magnificent. She wasn't just a healer, she was a survivor. "Theo," Domenico said quietly. The bodyguard unholstered his weapon, aiming it down at the weeping doctor. "No!" Leora shouted instinctively, stepping between the gun and doctor. "Henderson." The room went dead silent. Domenico's eyes narrowed. "He betrayed you, Leora. He sold your life for a few chips at a casino. In my world, treason is paid in blood. We are not in your world." Leora fired back, her chest heaving. "I am a nurse. I do not take life. And I will not let you execute a man in front of me." Domenico stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, a slow, dark smile curved his lips. He raised his hand, signaling Leo to lower the weapon. "You hear that, Peter?" Domenico asked softly. "The angel of mercy just saved your miserable life." Domenico shifted his gaze back to Leo. "Take the doctor to the airstrip. Put him on a plane to South America. If he ever sets foot in the United States again, if he ever contacts his family, put a bullet in his kneecaps and throw him in the Atlantic." The guards dragged the sobbing, profusely thanking doctor out of the room. Leora stood frozen, the reality of her new life crashing over her. She turned to look at Domenico. He was a monster, a criminal, a man who dealt in death. But he had also saved her sister, spared a man's life at her request, and looked at her like she was the only thing holding his fractured world together. Domenico slowly patted the edge of his mattress. "Come here, Leora." She hesitated, glancing at Sophia, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, Leora crossed the room and stood by his bedside. Domenico reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently wrapping around her wrist. He didn't pull her down, he simply anchored her to him. "I told you I wasn't for sale," Leora whispered, though the fight had drained out of her voice, replaced by a strange magnetic pull. "I know," Domenico murmured, his thumb brushing over her racing pulse. "I don't want to buy you, Leora. I want you to rule them with me." He pulled her down just enough so their lips were inches apart. The scent of antiseptic and his expensive cologne wrapped around her, intoxicating and dangerous. "Ugh. Everyone fears you," she breathed, her hazel eyes locked onto his obsidian gaze. "Oh, everyone but you," he replied before closing the distance and pressing his lips to hers. It wasn't a forceful kiss, it was a surrender. The Mafia boss had finally found the one woman who could command him, and the ordinary nurse realized that sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to become its queen. What did you think of Leora's ultimate choice to embrace the darkness and stay with Domenico? Would you have made the same deal to protect your family? If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance story, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, real-life inspired dramas. Drop a comment below on what trope we should tackle next.